periods in every man's life when the concentrated sorrow and bitterness of years seems gathered into one short day and night of agony. In less than 48 hours, 1/3 of my entire command had been swept away. My own boy brother lay dead on the field. And Stonewall Jackson, my old professor, my commanding officer, lay mortally wounded and probably dying, shot by my men. The scene as I marched through the burning woods was harrowing. Unexploded shells and muskets going off in all directions, the dead of both sides enveloped in flames, the cries of helpless wounded Federals, the pall of stifling smoke made it a perfect hell on earth. My brigade was in nearly every great battle, but in none did I ever witness so many harrowing scenes as I did at Chancellorsville. General James Lane, CSA.
Chancellorsville.
In 1861, the Civil War began as a war to restore the Union. By the spring of 1863, it had become a struggle to transform a nation. The freedom of 4 million slaves, the fate of Southern society, and the destiny of a nation just 87 years old floated precariously on the riptides of war. No one bore the burden of national tragedy more than President Abraham Lincoln. The battles inscribed on Union banners recorded stalemate and defeat in the East. Worst of all was Fredericksburg. The one-sided slaughter there in December 1862 left Northern politicians, civilians, and soldiers alike demoralized and angry. Lincoln knew the only remedy for national despair, the only antidote to the raging debate over the newly issued Emancipation Proclamation, would be victory in battle. Without that, Northern support for the war would falter. To revitalize the stumbling war effort in the East, Lincoln named Major General Joseph Hooker to command of the Army of the Potomac, the 5th Union general to face the Confederates in Virginia.
Oh, yeah.
The Union Army had been humiliated at Fredericksburg in December, but under Hooker's management, it recovered. By April 1863, it was confident, healthy, and immense, 134,000 men. Just as Lincoln bore the anguish of Union failure, Confederate General Robert E. Lee bore the weight of Confederate hopes. With Confederate armies in retreat elsewhere across the South, with Southern ports blockaded, with Southern women struggling to feed their families, more and more did the people of the South look to Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia to sustain their cause. Lee knew that victory on Northern soil in 1863 would uplift the Confederacy and devastate Union morale. But before Lee could move north, he needed more supplies, more strength. He also needed to reckon with Hooker and his army. As Virginia's dogwoods bloomed that spring, Hooker's army began to stir. In their camps south of the Rappahannock, around Fredericksburg, Lee's 60,000 men awaited Hooker's move. Before the beginning of the new campaign, Lee's chief lieutenant, General Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson, had one last matter to attend to. On April 20th, 1863, Jackson met his 5-month-old daughter, Julia, for the first time.
During the whole of this short visit, my husband rarely had Julia out of his arms, walking her and amusing her in every way that he could think of. Sometimes holding her up before a mirror and saying admiringly, "Now, Miss Jackson, look at yourself."
Isn't she Jim? Oh, she's beautiful.
Mary Ann Jackson.
For a few days, one of the most efficient military men in the world played the role of father, joyful, playful, and attentive. But on April 29th, a courier ended the Jackson family reunion with ominous news. Hooker's men were on the move. Lee and Jackson must be moving too. Chancellorsville was not a village, but a house at an unremarkable crossroads 12 miles west of Fredericksburg in the wilderness of Spotsylvania County. Frances Chancellor, her 6 daughters, and 1 son lived at Chancellorsville. 2 years of war had brought much change to the Chancellors. Their slaves had run off. Occasional Yankee raiders forced Mrs. Chancellor to hide her stock of meat under the front porch. She stuffed corn under the beds. The Chancellor girls greeted Yankee soldiers with icy reserve. But they welcomed their Confederate protectors. 14-year-old Sue Chancellor remembered.
My sisters were very nice to the defenders of our country and played on the piano and sang for them, and they taught my sisters to play cards, of which my mother disapproved. But they all seemed to have a grand time. They were right nice to me, too.
I have got Lee just where I want him.
Above
Joseph
all,
Hooker.
Joseph Hooker resolved to avoid the mistakes of his predecessor, Ambrose Burnside. He would not simply hurl his army against the heights behind Fredericksburg. Instead, in late April, he unveiled a more elaborate plan. Union cavalry dashed to the Confederate rear to cut Lee's supply lines. 1/3 of Hooker's infantry under John Sedgwick crossed at Fredericksburg, hoping to deceive Lee into thinking the main crossing would come there. Meanwhile, Hooker led the rest of his army upstream, crossing the Rappahannock and Rapidan above Lee's position. This was the decisive move. Lee would have to retreat or fight on ground of Hooker's choosing. On April 30th, Hooker's main column moved into the tangled wilderness around Chancellorsville, directly on Lee's left flank. The next morning, May 1st, 1863, Hooker ordered his army to move east from Chancellorsville toward Lee's flank. Lee responded to the crisis with typical boldness. Leaving a small force to confront the Union bluff at Fredericksburg, he and Jackson started west to stop Hooker's columns. At midday on May 1st, the Confederates collided with Hooker about 2 miles east of Chancellorsville. Soon after the fighting started, Hooker ordered his army back into defensive works near the Chancellorsville crossroads.
Put your backs in, gentlemen!
The Federals started digging. Hooker dared the Confederates to attack them. Lee and Jackson would oblige. The Confederate leaders faced daunting problems. Behind them, at Fredericksburg, 12,000 Confederates faced Sedgwick's 40,000 Federals, threatening to move westward toward Lee's rear. In front, at Chancellorsville, 45,000 Confederates faced Hooker's 72,000. But Lee soon learned the Union right flank, 3 miles west of Chancellorsville, lay unprotected. A series of narrow roads might lead an unseen Confederate force to that exposed Union flank. Lee and Jackson settled on a bold plan. Jackson would take 2/3 of the army on an arcing 12-mile march across the Union front to strike the Union right. Lee would remain in front of Hooker's main force, 14,000 men facing 72,000. Never had Lee taken such a gamble. He desired not just victory, but destruction of Hooker's army. Shortly after dawn, on May 2nd, Lee and Jackson parted. On narrow roads, Jackson's column marched, the heat rising as the day progressed.
The officers continually called out, "Close up, man, close up." Many of our poor fellows stepped aside, jerked off their knapsacks and bundles, hastily selected a few precious things, and ran on to resume their places. This flank march was 12 miles. We had to make the march and fight the battle at the end of it without any food except for what each man could eat as he marched. Frederick Colston, Alexander's Artillery Battalion, CSA.
Jackson's was on us, and fear was on us.
By late afternoon, 20,000 of Jackson's men stood astride the Orange Turnpike, opposite the Union right flank. When told that his leading division was ready, Jackson nodded and said, "You can go forward then."
Oh God.
Gee, this was Jackson. Lee launched a surprise attack. Surprise.
Jackson's assault staggered the Union right flank, the 11th Corps. Some Federal regiments managed to turn and fight. Pockets of resistance slowed the Confederate juggernaut. But after 2 hours, the entire 11th Corps had been driven from the field back toward Chancellorsville. Unable to rally the 11th Corps, Hooker patched together a new line of troops a half-mile west of Chancellorsville. Thousands of men stumbled through the gathering darkness. Flashes of musketry illuminated the gloom. Blasts of artillery from the high ground at Fairview ripped through the forest. The Confederate attack lost its momentum. Still, Jackson sought the destruction of Hooker's entire army. Despite the darkness, he personally scouted in front of his line to find a way to keep his attack going. As Jackson and his party returned, wild volleys from North Carolina regiments laced through the woods. "Cease firing! You are firing into your own men!" yelled one of Jackson's staff officers. But the call came too late. Bullets from his own soldiers tore into Jackson's left arm and right hand. His arm would be amputated later that night. The day had been a success for Lee and Jackson, but with Jackson gravely wounded, that success had come at a devastating cost.
Jackson died. He was shot from his own men. I am sick of honors now. Horrors now.
The next morning, Rice Bull watched the dawn at Chancellorsville.
Never was there a more beautiful sunrise. Not a cloud in the sky. It was an ideal Sunday morning. It seemed to me like a sacrilege that such a sacred day should be used by men to kill and maim each other.
Sunday, May 3rd, 1863, would be one of the bloodiest days in American history. Lee's army remained dangerously divided. He needed to reunite his force with Jackson's corps.
I'd very much like to know the enemy's strength and position.
Only then could he pursue his goal, the destruction of Hooker's Army of the Potomac. Cavalryman Jeb Stuart took command of Jackson's corps. Early on May 3rd, Hooker contracted his lines into earthworks surrounding the Chancellorsville crossroads. But in doing so, he left the high ground at Hazel Grove to Lee. Confederate artillery swarmed atop the plateau. Southern infantry launched a massive assault, one of the largest of the war. Near Fairview, Rice Bowl and thousands of other Federals saw the onslaught coming.
Looking down the line of our company as the yelling of the enemy came nearer and nearer to us, I judged that everyone felt about
Did you hear that?
There was a deadly now.
It's with a rebel yell.
I could see pallor on every face. I believe every arm trembled as we raised our guns to our shoulders to fire, but all eyes were to the front. This was a testing time.
Dozens of Union guns roared to life from Fairview, ravaging the exposed Confederate lines.
The biggest tree afforded no protection from those cannons. One might have rode in front and behind. The mountains and the tops were falling about us as if torn by a cyclone. flashing his guns could be seen only a few feet away. The fellow can't see very far in the fight. He sees a plane and he's scared. What a din.
I didn't see any.
Variety of hideous
That was our
noise.
artillery.
Great opera.
That was our big guns.
Nicholas Weeks, 3rd Alabama Infantry.
For 5 hours, fighting raged in the woods around Chancellorsville. For 5 hours, a man fell, killed, or wounded every second. Nearly 18,000 in all. Grudgingly, the Federals fell back. The Confederates surged through the woods and into the Chancellorsville clearing. From the porch of the Chancellor House, Joseph Hooker watched as his battle lines collapsed upon him. A Confederate cannonball crashed into one of the pillars, stunning the general, leaving him insensible and the army leaderless. In the cellar, the Chancellor women and a handful of refugees huddled in fear. Late that morning, the house caught fire. A Union officer led the Chancellors and the other civilians out of the inferno.
The sight that met our eyes as we came out of the dim light of that basin defies description. The woods around the house were a sheet of fire. The air was filled with shot and shell. Horses were running, rearing, and screaming. The men, a mass of confusion, moaning, cursing, and praying. Cannons were booming in every direction. If anybody thinks that a battle is an orderly attack of rows of men, I can tell them differently, for I have been there. Sue Chancellor.
While the Chancellor's home burned, disorganized Federals hurried to a new line north of the intersection. Victorious Confederates swarmed into the Chancellorsville clearing.
So Chancellorsville was won by the
Confederates.
by the rebel.
Confederates.
Yeah.
Victory on May 3rd brought no relief for Robert E. Lee. Just hours after capturing the crossroads, Lee faced a new emergency. Sedgwick's troops had broken through the Confederate lines at Fredericksburg. The Federals turned west, toward the rear of Lee's victorious army. Lee divided his army yet again, leading 20,000 men east to confront Sedgwick. That afternoon, Lee's men stopped Sedgwick's advance in bloody fighting at Salem Church. The next day, the Confederates drove Sedgwick back across the Rappahannock. To Hooker, any chance of victory disappeared with Sedgwick's retreat. On May 6th, in a pounding rain, Hooker marched his army out of its earthworks north of Chancellorsville, away from his enemy. A melancholy retreat back across the Rappahannock.
The Union is worth fighting for 20 years.
By battle's end, more than 3,000 dead lay in woods and fields around Chancellorsville. Another 20,000 lay wounded, dozens of miles from the nearest permanent hospital. In a farm office near Guinea Station, 20 miles from the battlefield, Stonewall Jackson struggled for life. On May 7th, he developed pneumonia and soon sank toward death.
When his child was brought to him, he played with her for some time, frequently caressing her and calling her his little comforter. At one time, he raised his wounded hand above her head and, closing his eyes, was for some moments silently engaged in prayer. He said to me, "I see from the number of physicians that you think my condition dangerous, but I thank God, if it is His will, that I am ready to go." Dr. Hunter McGuire, Medical Director, Jackson's Corps.
Thomas J. Stonewall Jackson died on May 10th, 1863. Lee lamented, "I do not know how to replace him."
Lee lamented, "I don't know how to replace him."
They don't even have stethoscopes, the doctors.
He probably deserved it.
Huh?
He probably
Abraham
deserved
Lincoln
it.
shuddered at the news of Chancellorsville.
My God, What will the country say? What will the country say?
But Lee took little pleasure in his stunning victory. 1/5 of his army was killed or wounded. Jackson was dead, and Hooker's army had escaped. Still, Chancellorsville gave Lee his long-sought opportunity to take the war north. In early July, at Gettysburg, Lee would try some of the same tactics that had worked so well at Chancellorsville. A bold advance on the first day, a sweeping flank attack on the second, and brutal frontal assaults on the third. But this time, Lee faced determined Union troops fighting on their own soil. Union victory at Gettysburg robbed Lee of all he had gained at Chancellorsville. Never again would he take the strategic offensive. In 1864, Lincoln's struggling war effort found momentum under Ulysses S. Grant. Battle returned to this region in still bloodier form at the Wilderness and at Spotsylvania Courthouse. When the armies finally left Spotsylvania in May 1864, the grinding path to war's end was set. A path to a nation reunified. A path to freedom for 4 million enslaved Americans. The armies left behind scars that nature still struggles to heal. Fading earthworks, the home places of bygone families, and the granite tributes to those who fought still mark this land. They remind us of citizens and soldiers who bore fearful sacrifices, pursuing competing visions for a nation. Americans whose struggle launched a quest for a more perfect union that continues still.
That was pretty good.
Yeah.